The cafe breathed an uneasy quiet that morning, the kind of stillness that doesn't come from peace, but from a shared, unspoken anxiety. Conversations were reduced to murmurs. Spoons clinked against porcelain with unnatural care. Even the familiar hum of the espresso machine seemed subdued, as if afraid to disturb the air. At the corner by the wide front window, occupying the best seat in the house, sat Alexander Grant. In this city, his name stirred a conflicted mixture of admiration and dread. He was a self-made millionaire, celebrated in the business pages, whispered about in back rooms, notorious not for his generosity, but for his temper, arrogance, and impossible standards. His presence was like a heavy storm cloud rolling into an otherwise clear day, darkening everything beneath it. Everyone knew the stories, how he had reduced waitstaff to tears, how managers had endured public humiliation, how a barista had once walked out mid-shift after one particularly sharp remark. No one wanted to become the next anecdote. This morning Alexander was dressed in a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, the knot of his tie so precise it could have been measured. He sat with his back straight, tapping 2 fingers against the marble tabletop in a slow, steady rhythm. His eyes scanned the room as though searching for flaws invisible to anyone else. Behind the counter, the staff moved with brisk precision, their glances darting toward him as if to monitor an unpredictable tide. No one spoke above a cautious whisper. The tension was almost tangible. When his order arrived, a double espresso with a dusting of nutmeg, the server set it down with a careful smile before retreating. Alexander lifted the cup, inhaled briefly, and took a sip. The sound of his voice cut through the quiet like glass shattering on tile. "This coffee is an insult," he said sharply, his words carrying across the entire cafe. Every conversation stopped. Forks hovered above plates. The sudden slam of his cup onto the saucer echoed, a deliberate punctuation to his disdain. From the far table, a woman paused mid-bite, eyes narrowing as though bracing for a storm. Near the entrance, a man folded his newspaper slowly, his gaze fixed on Alexander, as if this were a show he'd seen before. At the counter, the young barista who had prepared the espresso froze, his face draining of color. This was his 3rd week on the job. His hands, still resting on the counter, trembled almost imperceptibly. Alexander leaned back in his chair, one hand resting on the armrest like a judge about to deliver a verdict. His gaze swept the cafe once more, stopping briefly on the barista before moving on, as though weighing who might bear the brunt of his displeasure. The silence thickened, pressing in from all sides. A single thought seemed to ripple through the room. Who would he turn on first? Somewhere in the back, the manager stepped out from the kitchen, already adjusting his glasses and forcing an apologetic smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He knew this routine and the weight it carried. But for now, Alexander simply sat there, the rejected espresso in front of him, his tapping fingers resuming their steady, deliberate rhythm. It was the sound of someone waiting for the next misstep, the next excuse to unleash what everyone feared was coming. The manager approached with quick, careful steps, each one measured as though he were walking a tightrope. His name was Daniel Pierce, a thin man with neatly combed hair and glasses that slid down his nose whenever he was nervous, which was often in Alexander's presence. "Mr. Grant," Daniel began, his voice steady in volume but trembling at the edges. "I'm terribly sorry if the coffee wasn't to your liking. Alexander cut him off without looking up. "Sorry doesn't change the fact that I'm drinking something I wouldn't serve to a stray dog." The words were delivered flatly, but with a precision that seemed crafted to sting. All eyes in the cafe were on them now. The air carried that brittle quality that comes just before glass shatters. Daniel adjusted his glasses and forced the smallest of nods. "May I have it remade for you?" Alexander's gaze finally shifted to him, sharp and unyielding. "You can start by telling me who made it, and then you can tell me why your standards have dropped to this embarrassing low." Behind the counter, the young barista's head lowered slightly, as though that might make him invisible. His name was Noah, 20 years old, first job since leaving school. The others had warned him about Alexander, how the man noticed every detail and tolerated nothing less than perfection. Daniel hesitated, But Alexander's stare didn't leave him. "It was Noah," Daniel said quietly. Alexander leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and spoke loudly enough for the entire cafe to hear. "Noah, was it? I'd like to know what goes through your mind when you think this," he gestured to the cup with a flick of his hand. "Is worth serving." Noah didn't move. His throat worked as though he were trying to swallow words that refused to form. "Come on, boy," Alexander pressed, his tone turning sharper. "I'm giving you the chance to explain yourself." When no reply came, Alexander's voice rose, each syllable deliberate. "This is the problem. No pride, no accountability, and yet you expect people to pay for mediocrity." A woman sitting by the wall shook her head slightly, her eyes darting toward Noah in sympathy. Two businessmen near the door exchanged glances but said nothing. Noah's lips finally parted, but before a sound emerged, Daniel stepped in. "Sir, Noah is still new. I'll make sure—" Alexander dismissed the interruption with a curt wave. "Don't defend him. You're doing him no favors. If he can't handle criticism, he's in the wrong line of work." The words landed with the weight of a public sentence. Noah's cheeks flushed, and his hands retreated beneath the counter, curling into fists out of sight. Alexander leaned back again, his expression calm, almost bored, as though this confrontation was just another routine moment in his day. The espresso sat untouched now, a symbol of the offense he claimed it carried. Daniel cleared his throat, eager to end the scene. "I'll have a fresh one made right away." Alexander gave a small disinterested nod, then looked toward the window, his attention shifting away from the people he had just unsettled. But the damage was done. Noah remained frozen, his mind replaying the humiliation over and over. The customers turned their eyes away, but the silence in the room had deepened. It was no longer the silence of anticipation. It was the silence left behind after something breaks. Near the far side of the cafe, a young waitress carrying a tray paused mid-step. Her gaze fixed on the scene she had just witnessed. She had only been here a week, but in that brief time she had heard the whispers, seen the nervous glances when Alexander walked in. She knew the rule everyone followed without question: stay out of his way. Yet as she looked at Noah, standing pale and speechless behind the counter, she felt something tighten in her chest. And as she stood there, tray in hand, she realized she was already deciding to break that rule. Her name was Claire Morgan. At 25, she was no stranger to rude customers. Before this cafe, she had worked in a small diner on the edge of town, where tempers flared as often as coffee was poured. But what she had just witnessed was different. This wasn't irritation over a wrong order or a careless mistake. This was deliberate, a performance meant to humiliate. She adjusted the tray in her hands, the aroma of the cappuccinos she carried mixing with the sharper scent of tension in the air. Around her, the other servers moved like shadows, careful to remain unnoticed. She understood why. In her first week, she had overheard Daniel warn another newcomer in a hushed voice, "When Mr. Grant is here, you keep your head down. Do your job. Don't give him a reason to notice you." That was the rule everyone followed. But as she glanced toward Noah, standing stiff behind the counter, his eyes fixed somewhere on the floor, Claire felt that rule pressing against her like a locked door. Her mother had taught her long ago that respect wasn't something people earned with wealth. It was something every person deserved simply for existing. She could hear her mother's voice even now. "You don't let anyone take away your dignity, and you don't stand by when someone tries to take it from others." She stepped toward an empty table and set the tray down, her movements automatic. Across the room, Alexander remained in his seat, one hand resting casually on the table, his gaze drifting toward the street outside, as though nothing of consequence had happened. Claire lingered for a moment, watching him. There was nothing rushed in his demeanor, no sign of guilt or second thoughts. If anything, he looked comfortable. From the corner of her eye, she caught Daniel giving her a quick, warning glance. It was subtle but clear. "Don't get involved." She bent slightly to straighten the sugar packets on the table, buying herself a few seconds to think. Her pulse had quickened, but her breathing stayed steady. She knew what everyone else was thinking, and that speaking up could mean losing her job, that Alexander Grant's influence extended far beyond the walls of this cafe. But she also knew she wouldn't sleep tonight if she stayed silent. Claire straightened, her eyes locking on Alexander. She replayed the scene in her head, the sharpness in his voice when he said to Noah, "If he can't handle criticism, he's in the wrong line of work." She thought about Noah's face, the heat in his cheeks, the way his hands had vanished beneath the counter. She could feel the decision solidifying inside her. The voices in the cafe remained hushed, cautious, a collective attempt to keep the air from shaking again. But beneath that quiet, she sensed the unease, the discomfort people carried when they watched something wrong happen and felt powerless to stop it. Claire was not powerless. She took a slow breath, collected the tray she had set down, and walked toward the counter. She returned the empty cups to their place, then stepped back into the center of the cafe. Alexander's table was just a few strides away. For a moment she stood still, the distance between them holding all the tension in the room. If she crossed it, there would be no going back. Her hand tightened around the edge of the tray, and without another thought she began to walk toward him. The room seemed to notice her movement before Alexander did. Conversations that had been reduced to whispers now stopped altogether. The quiet was not empty. It was loaded, waiting. Claire stopped at the edge of his table. Alexander's gaze lifted slowly from the street outside to her face, his expression unreadable at first. "Yes?" he said, his tone clipped, as though he were about to send back another plate of food without explanation. Claire kept her voice calm. "Mr. Grant, I think the way you just spoke to our barista was unacceptable." A flicker of surprise crossed his eyes, quickly replaced by something harder. "Unacceptable," he repeated, leaning back slightly in his chair as if giving her space to reconsider. "Do you know who you're talking to?" "I do," she answered evenly. "And I also know that everyone here is just trying to do their job. Mistakes happen, but dignity shouldn't be the price for pointing them out." He studied her for a long moment, his eyes narrowing. "Are you lecturing me about manners over a cup of bad coffee?" "I'm telling you that behind every cup is a person," she said. "A person who put effort into making it. Even if it wasn't perfect this time, tearing them down in front of an entire room doesn't fix anything." From behind the counter, Noah stood frozen, his hands gripping the edge of the workspace. Daniel remained near the register, his jaw tight as if ready to step in but unwilling to interrupt. Alexander's fingers tapped against the armrest of his chair. "You're new here, aren't you?" he asked finally. "A week," Claire replied. "Then let me give you some advice," he said, his voice low but carrying. "If you plan to last in this business, you don't challenge the customer." She met his gaze without flinching. "Respect goes both ways. Whether you're the customer or the person serving the coffee, it's not optional." Around them, the other customers were no longer pretending not to listen. A man in the corner leaned forward in his seat. A woman by the window held her breath, her eyes darting between the two. Alexander's jaw tightened, and for a moment it seemed he was about to unleash the full force of his temper, but the words didn't come. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and regarded her with something between irritation and curiosity. "You've got nerve," he said finally. "Maybe," she replied. "Or maybe I just don't like seeing people treated badly when they're doing their best." There was a pause, the kind that made every second feel heavier. Then, in a voice still sharp but lacking the venom from earlier, he said, "Fine, get me another cup and make sure it's done right this time." Claire gave a single nod. "Thank you for your patience," she said, the words deliberate, and then turned toward the counter. The air in the cafe seemed to shift slightly as she walked away, not lighter but different, as though something had cracked in the wall of fear that had stood there for years. Behind her, Alexander picked up his spoon and stirred the remnants of the rejected espresso without drinking it. His gaze followed her for a moment longer before returning to the street outside. Claire reached the counter and set the tray down. Noah's eyes met hers briefly, gratitude flickering there, though he said nothing. Daniel exhaled slowly, his shoulders lowering by an inch. And though no one spoke it aloud, everyone in that room knew they had just witnessed something rare, someone stepping directly into the path of a man who was used to watching people step aside. Claire didn't retreat to the safety of the kitchen. She stayed at the counter watching Noah prepare the new espresso. His hands were steadier now, though his jaw was still tight. The rest of the staff moved around them cautiously, as if afraid that the quiet might not last. When the coffee was ready, Claire carried it herself. She set it down gently in front of Alexander. "Fresh cup," she said, her tone as calm as before. Alexander glanced at it, but kept his eyes on her instead. "You know," he said slowly, "most people in your position would have kept their mouth shut, saved themselves the trouble." "Most people," Claire replied, "aren't okay with watching someone be torn apart for making a mistake." He leaned forward slightly, resting his elbows on the table. "You think I was too harsh? I think your words said more about you than they did about the coffee," she answered, her voice steady. A faint murmur rippled through the cafe, the kind that happens when people aren't sure whether to admire someone's courage or fear the consequences of it. Alexander's gaze sharpened. "You're making assumptions about my character based on one exchange?" "No," Claire said. "I'm making observations, and I've seen enough to know that being right about a mistake doesn't give anyone the right to strip someone else of their dignity." For a moment, it looked as though he might explode. His shoulders shifted, his jaw clenched, and his eyes narrowed in a way that had sent others scrambling before. But instead of raising his voice, he let out a slow breath, leaning back in his chair. "You talk like you've been on the receiving end of that kind of treatment," he said. Claire's reply was simple. "I've worked in places where respect was treated like a luxury. I don't think it should be." The silence that followed wasn't tense this time. It was curious, almost measuring. Alexander finally picked up the cup, took a slow sip, and set it down without comment. Across the room, a few customers exchanged glances, as though they had just seen something shift. Daniel stood near the register, his expression still cautious but tinged with relief. Noah pretended to busy himself with cleaning, but his eyes kept flicking toward the table. Alexander broke the quiet first. "It's better," he said, referring to the coffee, though his tone lacked the dismissive edge from before. Claire nodded once. "Good." She didn't linger. She turned and walked back toward the counter, her pace unhurried. Something subtle had changed in the air. The oppressive weight that usually followed Alexander into the cafe was lighter, not gone, but weakened. People resumed their conversations more quickly than they normally would after one of his outbursts. Alexander watched her as she worked, his expression unreadable. It wasn't admiration, not yet, but it also wasn't the disdain he often wore like armor. Claire didn't look his way again. She greeted a new customer with the same warmth she gave to everyone else, her voice steady, her movements unflustered. She had stepped into the storm, spoken her truth, and emerged without a scratch. And though no one said it aloud, the shift was felt by everyone who had been there to witness it. The following morning, the cafe opened as it always did, the smell of fresh pastries mixing with the sharp scent of brewing coffee. Yet for the staff, there was a question hanging in the air. Would Alexander Grant return? And if he did, would yesterday's confrontation mean anything? By mid-morning, the question was answered. The door opened and there he was, the same perfectly pressed suit, the same measured stride. But there was something different in the way he entered. His eyes swept the room, but the scan felt less like a hunt for flaws and more like simple observation. Daniel greeted him with a polite, "Good morning, Mr. Grant," his voice cautious but not strained. Alexander's reply was brief. "Morning." No cutting remark followed. He took his usual seat by the window. Claire noticed him immediately, but didn't alter her pace. She carried a tray to a nearby table, exchanged a few words with a couple ordering lattes, and returned to the counter. Only then did she approach him, order pad in hand. "Your usual?" she asked. "Yes," he said, and then, after a pause, "Please." It was a single word, but one that drew Daniel's attention from across the room. Alexander Grant rarely bothered with such additions. Claire wrote the order without comment and handed it to Noah, who seemed far more confident today. Within minutes, the double espresso with a dash of nutmeg was ready. Claire delivered it to the table. "Fresh and hot," she said. Alexander picked it up, took a sip, and set it down without any sign of displeasure. "Better," he said, the word flat but not laced with contempt. "Glad to hear it," Claire replied before stepping away. The cafe continued on as usual, but the difference was noticeable. The staff moved with more ease, and conversations didn't dip to whispers when Alexander spoke. Toward the end of his visit, Alexander called out to Daniel. "Service was good today," he said plainly. Daniel blinked, caught off guard. "Thank you, sir." Alexander left shortly after, his departure as unceremonious as his arrival. But once the door closed behind him, the staff exchanged glances, quiet smiles spreading. It was the smallest of victories, but in a place where victories against Alexander Grant were rare, it was enough to feel like the start of something. Claire wiped down the counter, pretending not to notice the way Noah kept glancing at her. Finally, he spoke. "Thanks for yesterday," he said quietly, his voice almost swallowed by the sound of the grinder. She looked at him. "You don't owe me thanks. Just don't let one bad moment make you doubt yourself." Noah gave a small nod, his mouth twitching into the hint of a smile. And for the rest of the shift there was a sense, unspoken but shared, that the air in the cafe had shifted. The man who had walked in with a shadow over every table had left with less of it trailing behind him. Over the next several weeks, Alexander's visits became a regular part of the cafe's rhythm again, but the tension that used to spread through the room at the sight of him no longer carried the same weight. People still noticed when he walked in, but they didn't shrink into themselves. He still expected precision. If his coffee arrived lukewarm, he would send it back. If his pastry wasn't fresh, he would say so. Yet the sharp cruelty that once colored his every complaint was gone. One Tuesday morning, he called Claire over after taking a sip of his drink. "This is exactly how it should be," he said, and though his voice was as flat as ever, the words landed like something rare. "Glad it meets your standard," Claire replied, noting the faintest twitch at the corner of his mouth that might have been the start of a smile. Another time he asked, "What do you recommend with the coffee today?" Claire considered. "The almond croissant is fresh from the oven, but if you want something less sweet, the oat biscuit pairs well." Alexander nodded. "I'll try the croissant." Daniel, who overheard from the counter, later remarked quietly to Noah, "That's the first time I've heard him ask for advice on anything." It wasn't just the staff who noticed. Regular customers began to pick up on the difference. The woman who usually sat near the wall mentioned to a friend, "He still looks like he's ready to argue with the world, but he's softer somehow." Claire didn't dwell on it. She treated Alexander as she did every other customer, polite but unflinching. If she thought about it at all, it was only in passing. The way his thank yous, though infrequent, had stopped sounding like obligations and started sounding like choices. One morning, when the cafe was half full and the sunlight was catching dust motes in the air, Alexander lingered longer than usual. He sat with his empty cup in front of him, watching people pass by outside. Then, as Claire walked past, he said, "Your mother must have taught you to speak your mind." Claire stopped. "She did," she said. "She also taught me that speaking up matters most when it's hardest to do." He studied her face for a moment before nodding once, as if filing the thought away. No further conversation followed, but something in his expression suggested he was still thinking about it when he left. By the end of that week, even Daniel admitted, "I don't know what you did, Claire, but he's different." She only shrugged. People can change when they're given a reason. And while no one could pinpoint the exact day it happened, the cafe slowly stopped being a place that braced itself for Alexander's visits. He had become part of the background, just another customer, still demanding, still particular, but no longer feared. Months passed, and the transformation settled into something permanent. The staff no longer exchanged worried glances when Alexander walked through the door. New employees were no longer warned about him in hushed tones. To them, he was simply another customer with exacting tastes. One morning, the cafe was bathed in winter light, pale and cold through the windows. Claire moved easily between tables, balancing orders in her head while keeping an eye on the counter. She noticed Alexander at his usual spot, reading a folded newspaper. His coat hung neatly over the back of the chair. When she approached, he looked up briefly. "The usual," he said, and then added, "And one of those oat biscuits you mentioned before." "Coming right up," she replied, jotting it down. The coffee was ready quickly. She set it on the table alongside the biscuit. "There you go," she said. Alexander took a sip and nodded slightly. "Perfect," he said, the word delivered plainly but without the sharpness that used to accompany his judgments. "Glad you think so," Claire replied. For a while he read in silence while she attended to other customers. When she passed his table again, he set the newspaper down and said, "You changed the way things work here." She paused. "I don't think I did anything extraordinary." "You stood up to me," he said. "Most people don't." Claire met his eyes. "Maybe they should." He gave a short laugh, not mocking, just acknowledging. "Maybe they should," he echoed. The conversation ended there, but there was an understanding in the way they regarded each other, not friendship exactly, but mutual respect. Later that morning, as he prepared to leave, Alexander placed cash on the table. Claire noticed the tip was larger than usual, not ostentatious but enough to be noticed. "Have a good day, Mr. Grant," she said as he gathered his things. He glanced back before stepping out. "You too, Miss Morgan." After he left, Noah leaned toward Claire from behind the counter. "You realize he calls you by name now?" "I noticed," she said, smiling faintly. The cafe settled back into its routine, but the change lingered in more than just the absence of tension. The staff moved with confidence. Customers chatted freely. Even the air felt lighter. And though no one spoke of it often, those who had been there on that first day remembered exactly when the shift began. They remembered a young waitress walking across the floor, tray in hand, to face the man who had made a room full of people go quiet. Claire didn't think of herself as a hero. She didn't tell the story to new staff or point it out to customers. She simply kept doing her job the same way she had from the start, greeting people warmly, treating her co-workers with care, and never letting fear decide her actions. But on certain mornings, when Alexander would sit by the window with his coffee and biscuit, there would be a moment, a brief exchange of glances, a nod, that said more than words could. It was an acknowledgement of the unspoken truth they both now understood. Respect was never about status. It was and always would be a two-way street.